The early church didn't move randomly. It moved where the Spirit pointed. And that raises the uncomfortable question we can't avoid, is that if Acts was a blueprint, are we following the fire or are we protecting the prison? You ever read the book of Acts and feel like you accidentally walked into the wrong genre? Like you thought you were getting a clean, inspiring origin story, and instead you got Acts, tongues of fire, and angel breakouts. Men speaking languages they never learned, a sound like a violent wind with no weather report, flames resting on heads like heaven's calling card, prison doors opening without keys, chains falling off like they were made of paper, and visions that don't just comfort people, they redirect entire lives. The early church didn't spread because it was socially acceptable. It spread because it was untouchable. And right now, in the world that feels controlled, curated, and spiritually numb, that hits different. So tonight we're going in. Welcome back to Broadcasting Seeds. I'm your host, Bennett, and I want to start with a question that's simple, but it'll mess with you if you just if you sit with it for more than 5 seconds. What if the early church didn't move forward because they had the right messaging, but because the Spirit of God was doing things that couldn't be explained away? Because if Acts is true, then the supernatural wasn't a side effect. It was the actual engine. And here's where this gets uncomfortable for so many people fast. This week, people are arguing about politics, institutions, power, influence, and narratives. Same old game, right? But in Acts, the disciples aren't trying to win seats at the table. They're not lobbying for Rome or lobbying Rome. They're not courting approval. They're not even trying to look credible. They're trying to stay obedient while reality keeps getting interrupted. The early church didn't grow because it was popular. It grew because it was undeniable. Tongues of fire, angel jailbreaks, and visions that hijacked their plans. That's not branding. That's power. And listen, I'm not saying every weird thing online is God or that every spiritual story you hear is automatically true. Some people are selling snake oil with a cross on the label. I get it, okay? But if you've ever felt like there's more going on than what you can see, if you've ever had that gut level sense that the world isn't just physical, it's going to feel more like a warning label. Also, quick favor, because this is how the show grows. If you like Broadcasting Seeds, hit like, share the episode, and give us a review, okay? And hey, send this to a friend who's been saying something's shifting lately, but I can't explain it. One more thing. If you're a researcher, investigator, creator, or you've got firsthand experiences that connect to these biblical supernatural threads or any other topic that I cover, reach out. Not in a weird way, and a let's compare notes kind of way, okay? Because once you see what's happening in Acts, you can't unsee it. And the real question becomes this. If the book of Acts is the blueprint, why does modern faith so often feel like it's missing the fire? Section 1, when the sky touched the street. And imagine standing in Jerusalem. It's Pentecost. You've got packed streets, pilgrims everywhere, noise, dust, tension. Who knows what else the place smells like? But you've got tension in the air. 50 days after the crucifixion, okay? 50 days. People are still whispering about the empty tomb, and then it happens. Not a metaphor, not a feeling, a sound, like a violent rushing wind. But there's no storm, there's no clouds, there's no weather, just a roar from nowhere that fills the room. That's where Acts begins. Not with strategy, not with a committee meeting, with interruption. The text says something that people skim past too quickly. It says, tongues of fire rested on each of them. Fire, not on the building, not above the city, on people. And suddenly they're speaking in languages they never studied, that they don't speak. Real languages, dialects from across the Roman world. Parthians, Medes, Egyptians, Arabs. The crowd is stunned because they're hearing their hometown dialect coming out of a Galatian fisherman. And here's what's wild. They aren't speaking to impress anybody. They're declaring the works of God right there in the street. Now pause with me for 1 second. Right now, in our time, people are obsessed with influence and platforms and algorithms, messaging strategies, viral moments. But in Acts, there's no PR team. There's obedience and ignition. And this week, people are starting to notice how fragile our systems are. Economies shake, institutions wobble, trust is evaporating. And the question everybody's quietly asking is, what actually has power? Acts answers that in a most uncomfortable way possible. Not politics, not persuasion, with presence. Tongues of fire didn't fall on a cathedral. They fell on ordinary people. The supernatural didn't crown an institution. It ignited individuals. Let me say something. If that happened today, would we recognize it? Or would we call it mass hysteria, emotional manipulation, or psyops? That's the best one. It's a psyop. Because here's the thing that hits me every time I read this. The crowd has options, right? Some were amazed. Some were absolutely confused. Some mocked and said, they're drunk. Same miracle, different interpretations. Does that sound familiar to you? Right now, we're living in an era where every event gets filtered through a narrative machine. Everything becomes spin. Everything becomes suspect. So when we read Acts, it forces us to confront something deeper. What if heaven doesn't care about our narratives? What if it moves anyway? Here's the part that should make you sit up straight. This wasn't the climax. It was the beginning, because fire was just the spark. Prison doors are about to open without keys. Angels are about to step into locked cells, and visions are about to reroute entire missions across continents. And the early church, they're about to learn something most of us have forgotten. When heaven moves, chains can't hold. They don't hold. And let's talk about the jailbreak. Section 2, when chains meant nothing. Picture this. You're locked in a first century prison, stone walls, iron bars, Roman guards who probably just don't play games. You've already been warned to stop speaking in the name of Jesus, and you didn't stop. And now you're inside again. That's where the second wave of Acts, tongues of fire, hits. Not in a prayer circle, not in a worship service, in a jail cell. Acts 5. The apostles were arrested for preaching publicly, boldly, not subtly. The religious authorities were irritated, to say the least. The political structure is threatened, and this movement isn't dying down. Frankly, it's multiplying. And so they do what power structures always do when they feel cornered. They try to contain it, lock it up, silence it, make it disappear. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opens the prison doors and brings them out. No dramatic explosion, no riot, just doors opening. Chains are irrelevant. And then the angel says something that almost feels reckless. Go, stand in the temple courts and tell the people all about this new life. Not hide, not relocate, not to tone it down. Go right back to the public square. And here's what should unsettle you. The next morning, the officials gather to bring the prisoners out for trial. and the doors are still locked. The guards are still standing at their posts, but the cells, they're empty. Let that sit for a second. The system thought it had control. The doors were locked. The guards were posted. The structure was intact, but heaven had already walked through it. Right now, people feel trapped in systems, financial systems, political systems, medical systems, digital systems, all the damn systems. You feel it. The sense that everything is monitored and regulated and categorized, right? And here's why Acts Tongues of Fire feels relevant in this moment, because it tells a story where the most secure system in the world at this time, that's Rome, couldn't hold what God was advancing. And the apostles, they didn't act like victims. They didn't act like rebels either. They acted like witnesses. There's a difference, folks. They weren't trying to overthrow Rome. They were trying to declare something higher. And when questioned, their response is simple. We must obey God rather than men. That's not bravado. That's what we call alignment. But here's where it gets even more intense. This wasn't a one-time jailbreak. In Acts 12, Peter arrested, guarded by four squads of soldiers, chains on both wrists, guards at the door. In the middle of the night, light fills the cell, and an angel strikes Peter on the side to wake him. Quick, get up. Chains fall off. What? The gates open on their own, and Peter walks out thinking it's a vision until he's standing in the street, free. So the tension building, angels broke him out, period. But what happens when the prison isn't physical? What happens when the chains are mental or spiritual or cultural? Because Acts doesn't just show external miracles, it shows something even harder to explain. Visions that reroute destiny. We'll talk about that next. Section 3, when visions reroute history. And what if the most dangerous prison isn't made of stone, but certainty? What if the real jailbreak in Acts wasn't iron chains falling off wrists, but mindsets breaking open? Because right when the early church starts gaining momentum, something happens that doesn't look explosive at all, right? It looks quiet. It's a vision, and it changes everything. Acts 10. Peter is praying on a rooftop, hungry, waiting for lunch, and he falls into a trance. He sees a sheet descending from heaven. Inside it, it's so bizarre, animals considered unclean under Jewish law. A voice says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter resists 3 times. The voice replies, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." Now pause. This isn't about diet. This is about inclusion. This is about the gospel crossing ethnic, cultural, and covenantal lines. And right now, people are starting to notice something about culture. Lines are everywhere. Political lines, ideological lines, religious lines. Everybody, I'm carnivore, I'm keto, I'm vegetarian. Everyone drawing circles and guarding the borders, right, of their lines. Acts flips that. God interrupts Peter, theological framework, and says, essentially, your map is outdated. And as Peter is trying to process the vision, messengers show up from Cornelius, who's a Roman centurion, a Gentile, an outsider, an officer in the very system that crucified our Lord Jesus. And the Spirit says, go with them. Do not hesitate. This is where Acts becomes more unsettling than inspirational. Because it's one thing for fire to fall, right? It's another thing for your worldview to just shift. And the Spirit didn't just break Peter out of prison. He broke Peter out of prejudice, okay? Let me ask you something honest. What would it take for your framework to change? Because if we're being real, most of us like supernatural stories as long as they confirm what we already believe, right? But Acts doesn't just confirm, it confronts. And right now, this week, people are arguing over who's in and who's out, who's clean, who's corrupt, who's chosen. These Epstein files are wild. Who's compromised, right? And Acts says something radical. The Spirit leads, not tribes, not factions, not narratives, period. The Spirit. And when Peter walks with into Cornelius's house and sees the Holy Spirit fall on Gentiles the same way it fell in Acts 2, it's a second Pentecost, not in Jerusalem, in a Roman's living room, okay? Heaven ignores the border. It doesn't mean anything. And here's the thread tying this all together. Tongues of fire, angel jailbreaks, rooftop visions. This isn't chaos, it's direction. The early church didn't move randomly. It moved where the Spirit pointed. And that raises the uncomfortable question we can't avoid, is that if Acts was a blueprint, are we following the fire or are we protecting the prison? We've got one layer left to peel back because the story doesn't end with miracles. It ends with momentum that couldn't be stopped. The fire was never meant to stay contained. Here's the part nobody talks about. The book of Acts doesn't actually end, okay? It just stops mid-movement. So weird. Paul's under house arrest. The gospel is spreading. Rome hasn't crushed it yet. The system hasn't contained it, though, and the fire has not gone out. And Luke closes the scroll without tying a neat bow on it. Why? Because Acts wasn't a movement. It was a momentum. Tongues of fire weren't the climax. Angel jailbreaks weren't the headline. Visions weren't spiritual entertainment. They were directional markers. They were proof that heaven doesn't just intervene, that heaven advances. And right now, in a world that feels curated, scripted, managed, monitored, that freaking matters. Because people are starting to notice that institutions wobble. Normal people, not people like some of us. Systems strain, right? Narratives just fracture. And lately there's this undercurrent of instability in everything from economics, politics, and trust. And the question people aren't saying out loud is this: what is actually real? Acts answers in the most unsettling way possible. What's real is what heaven backs. That's what's real. The tension with that, the early church didn't chase miracles. They obeyed. Fire fell, angels moved, visions redirected, but the through line wasn't spectacle. It was surrender. The power in Acts wasn't hype. It wasn't branding. It wasn't emotional manipulation. It was obedience under pressure. So let me bring this home. If you've felt lately like something is shifting, of course, like there's more happening beneath the surface of culture, like the visible world isn't telling the whole story, I assure you that you're not crazy. Acts suggests that the spiritual realm isn't distant at all and that it's active. But here's the part that hits hardest. The early church didn't try to control the fire. They positioned themselves under it. That's different. And if Acts, tongues of fire, and angel breakouts tells us anything, it's that the kingdom doesn't advance through force. It advances through yielding people who won't bow to fear. And yes, that's slightly unsettling because if that's true, then the next movement isn't institutional, it's personal. So here's what I'll leave you with. If Acts is the continuation of the gospel story and the fire never officially went out, then the question isn't whether God still moves. The question is whether we're paying attention. If this episode hit you, do me a favor, like it, share it, leave a review. That's how Broadcasting Seeds grows. Independent shows survive on engagement, okay? And seriously, send this to a friend who says, I feel like something spiritual is happening right now, but I don't know what to do with it. This has been Sunday Spiritual Sit Rep on Broadcasting Seeds. And remember, fire doesn't ask permission. It spreads. I'll see you in the next layer.
Don't say his name, don't cross that line. Doors were locked, guards on both sides. Stone walls thick, but heaven doesn't hide. You can chain a man, you can seal a door, but you can't hold back what was promised before. We felt it coming, like wind before the storm. Something shifting, something not normal. When the fire fell, it didn't ask permission. When the chains broke loose, it rewrote the prison. Tongues of flame on ordinary men, and the world hasn't been the same since then. When the fire fell, when the fire fell. When the fire fell. Rooftop vision, sheet from the sky. Borders breaking, old lines die. You can guard a gate, you can guard a throne, but you can't contain a kingdom not your own. We felt it rising underneath the skin. Not revolution, but something within. When the fire fell, it split the silence. When the light broke in, it defied the violence. Chains hit stone like thunder in the night, and the dark found out it can win the fight. When the fire fell, when the fire fell, when the fire fell. You can lock the door, you can post the guard, you can silence truth, but you won't get far, because fire spreads and wind won't bend and heaven doesn't end. When the fire